And because this is our last session together, I want to make sure to really dive a bit deeper with everyone and really sort of flex a bit of like what are some of the capabilities. And I think this is really a good case example of how do you build a story incrementally, where you're introducing things one at a time, you're incrementing things over time so that that story builds, as well as being able to show how you can layer information together through multiple swarms. So this is going to be a little bit more complex possibly than some of the other sessions we've been through, but I do think that, especially since this is our last session, it's worth it to dive into, and I think you guys will get a lot out of it. So let me first just tell the story. So I'm going to tell the story, and then we're actually going to go through and I'll show you how we build it itself. So this is looking at the blackout back in February. And there's sort of two things you need to know about this story. One is that, let me go back here. One is that if you go below this threshold right here is 59.4 hertz. And the alternating frequency going into your home is around 60 hertz, or it's typically at 60 hertz. And if it drops below this 59.4 threshold, it's actually causing damage to any equipment that's on the grid. So any generators or any motors that are part of it. And then the other thing you need to know is that Texas is its own power grid. It has, ERCOT is its own sort of entity, and there's the Western interconnect, and then there's the Eastern interconnect. So Texas is not connected into those other systems. So it is on its own. And so we're gonna look at 4 different dimensions here. We're gonna look at temperature, we're gonna look at the demand for electricity, the supply of electricity, and then down here, the price of electricity. So we start at the very top here in temperature. It got cold. It got below freezing here, starting on the 11th in Texas, and typically it's in the 50s. I think it's 54 is typically the average around that time of year. And as it's getting colder, people are using more electricity. So we're seeing this spike in demand going up to 72 gigawatts. And then on capacity, there's 100% capacity. It's 108 gigawatts, so well below that 72 gigawatts that I had previously mentioned. And the breakdown of that is that it's made up of mostly gas, so 47% gas, 29% wind, coal, solar, and nuclear. So all of those combined make up the energy mix for Texas. And so it was on the night of the 10th that we see the first decline in generation capacity, and that happened within wind. And so you'll notice I select here and I'm able to highlight just wind, and we can see that how these are the component parts of the whole. So just something I'm noting here, because that's one of the key things we're going to be covering. And so we see that decline in wind generation. And then as we move this time series forward, we see that on the 10th and 11th, things are pretty normal, around $30 for the price of electricity. And we see a 10x increase going to $300 on the 12th. And even though no customers have been turned off at this point, I think where you can really start to see that there's some strange things going on in the market is that you look at the market. Because this is a very free market economy, you can see that price jump way up. And so I'm not adjusting the scale of the y-axis yet. And so if I scale it back down, you can see how the price goes to $7,000. So they're really trying to do anything for people to, generate more electricity, any incentive possible. And so it was on the night of the 15th that that's when they basically went below the threshold. So here we're at 67 or 65 gigawatts total. And most of that is due to a drop in natural gas, which is the main component, of Texas's energy grid. But it's not just natural gas, right? It's drops actually across the board, including even one nuclear facility where the intake reservoir actually froze over. And so, if we go back to that frequency story, anytime they turn off customers, it has the effect of keeping the frequency up or moving the frequency up. And anytime power plants go offline, it drives the frequency down. And so basically the night of the 10th, they start to turn off customers, more power plants keep going offline, and that has the effect of dropping that frequency. And so it was at 1:51 in the morning that they actually dropped below that frequency. And so I don't think people realize, but Texas was actually like 4 minutes and 37 seconds away from a complete blackout, where if it's below this threshold for more than 9 minutes, they actually flips, like there's breakers that turn off that disconnect the power plant from the grid, which then has the effect of further decreasing the frequency. So you get this cascading effect where the whole state essentially would have been blacked out. And so they turned off 3 gigawatts worth of customers. And then 4 minutes later, which I couldn't even imagine how stressful it was, they turned off 3.5. And just in terms of magnitudes here, the last outage in the winter in Texas was 4 gigawatts total and was, news. And so these are not small calls in terms of how many customers they're turning off. And so they do end up coming back up here after that period of time. And that same cycle just keeps going. They have to turn off customers to balance the loss of power generation. And so it's this little red area, which doesn't look like much, but that is 20 gigawatts total of load shed during that period, 4.5 million customers, that this cost more than Katrina. It's $195 billion in damages and 70 deaths. And it's all contained right there in this red section of what couldn't be delivered. And that you can also see this in the price of electricity during that time as well, where we're now jumping to $9,000. So that's the story. And hopefully that's illustrative and you maybe learned something about Texas today. So today we're not going to build all of this, but the thing we are going to build together are the supply chart here, of which I would like to note that we are showing basically components of a whole. So this is the total sum, and then these are the component parts that make up that total. In addition, we have these lines of reference for what is 100%, so you can compare and contrast within. And then on the temperature, there's actually more going on here than I think people will see, and they'll see in the data, but you can see that there's a line for the average as well as then for the average of Texas over that period of time. So those are going to be the main things we focus on, and that idea of like how do we go and tell the story very iteratively, where we're going step to step, is sort of the main point here. So before I move forward here, love any reactions or any other questions or thoughts on what we just went through.
Michael, I love how you introduce everything in a very digestible manner, so it's very easy to take in, but you leave everything up. So if you want to go back and explore through it and take your time, you can. And especially at the end, you have all this information up, and I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Yeah, no, I think oftentimes people look at what we're doing and the thing they focus in on is, oh, it's 3D. That's the big aha, like that's the big thing. But I actually think one of the larger components here is the idea that you're building a story, that you're building each axis and explaining it and driving people through. And that actually has a ton of power. So I don't want to, lower the bar in terms of what 3D enables, but I do want people to think that, there's more going on here in terms of how you can tell a story that I think are very impactful mechanics. So let's actually start to dive in now. And I'm going to spend basically 5 minutes teaching you how to build this, and then we'll divide up and basically go through and build this together. Does that sound good?
I want to make one more meta point on this, right? So contrast what Michael did with a typical PowerPoint. Each one of these graphs would have been its own PowerPoint on its own slide. And because we have this 3D space that you can navigate through, you can keep the prior information active, keep it in your visual, if not directly in your visual view, in your brain fills in the fact that the temperature, chart is up above here and you just quickly look up to grab it, to take a look at it or whatever. That builds one complete conceptual model. And if you did this in PowerPoint, each time a slide disappears, you can't bring that set of information back into your mind in any way other than having a good memory. That taxes your mind, it's tiring, and the end user, doesn't walk away with as good a mental model. So yes, it is more than just that this is a 3D visualization. It is the fact that you've got a whole 3D space that you can navigate and build, but also maintain some of your prior information.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason, for adding that. And thanks for the chatter here in the chat window. I like the peanut gallery is active and sharing cool photos of very bad traffic. Yeah. Okay, so let's build this thing. So let's keep this mental image in mind of what we're after and start. So we're going to create a flow. I'm going to put this link into the chat window so everyone has it. This is going to be the data set that we're going to use. you'll notice there's two tabs, one for the Texas Power Supply and the other for temperature. So you're going to want to download each of these as their own CSV file. So I'm going to put that into the chat window now, just so people have it. And we're going to actually talk a little bit about the data first, because it's important to have a good mental model or image in your mind of like what the data is, so that as we go through this, it will make more sense. So first off, we have the date and time. So this was in the data set and in most data sets. So we have the dates as well as the time over to the right, and the easiest functions to write that add a little bit of additional filtering capability. And this is something we are working on and we'll have the ability to filter on, but for the moment, the easiest way to approach this is by a function called day. So you can equal day and then actually point to the actual cell itself, and that will pull back the day. And then we have the hour and minute, same formula. Now we have a calculated field here called total. I won't go through how we do the calculation, but it's just the sum of each of the day-hour combinations for each of the different fuel types to make up the total capacity. And then you can see that breakdown in capacity, and these are all in megawatts. And then you can see here the outage. So this is, think of minus as negative megawatts because you're removing capacity from the system. And that's why there's the outage amount. And then there's these other calculated fields, which are basically looking at the running sum of how much outage there is. So these are each of the outage events themselves that then keep adding into the overall outages. And you can see that percentages over here. Yep, so that's this spreadsheet. So that's pretty detailed here, and we can get into some of the nuance. But you'll notice there's a row for each fuel type, and that's repeated over and over and over. So you see totals over and over and over here. Natural gas, wind, so the same structure repeats. And then in terms of temperature on the other tab, there's actually more details than people, I think, realize in data. But we actually have, I think, 4 different cities, their historical temperature during that time period, as well as the average temperature during that period of time on an hourly basis. So anyways, those are the other temperature details here. So let's actually go into the flow again. And I'm going to present my screen a different way just for screen resolution purposes. I'm not 100% sure you guys can read my screen otherwise for this section. So I'm going to just be a little bit more explicit here. Okay. So we are in the editor and we're going to upload our data first. So we are going to select that data, and let's go ahead and start with the supply data, which will be this one that says Texas Power Blackout, Texas Power Supply.csv. We'll load that guy in, and right away we're seeing every dot here representative of one of the rows of the data sets. And let's start to order this in a more logical fashion. So we'll create a scatter plot with the date time on the width axis, and on the height axis we will put adjusted capacity. So this is number of gigawatts that exist, and then adjusted because of the power outages that are causing this. Now we'll see these all on one plane. If I add the depth characteristic here of looking at the different fuel types, we will then see this break out. So we can see the total is here, and then followed by natural gas, winds, blah, blah, blah. Now one caveat, and this is sort of an important detail to note, the order in which these are being shown is exactly the same order as you see it in the spreadsheet itself. So what I mean by that is that if I go to Texas Power Supply and I don't have total on top here, and instead I have that second, it's going to show up second in this graph. So we're working on the ability to sort within the editor itself so that you have more granular control over how things look and the order of things. But for now, that's something to note. The order here is significant. So one thing to note. So now this should look somewhat familiar. The things that are missing are connection lines and some other details. So let's start to fill those in, and then we'll go through the process of how we basically go through the filtering process. And so we're going to add in some colors here. So let's add a color scheme based on the different fuel type. And this fuel type, yeah, so this is fine. I'm just going to keep the defaults. And then what we're going to do is add in some connections so that we see these more as bars. And so the connection type is just going to be 2-axis or map. So it's just going to basically be these drop lines that come down. Now, I want to do one thing here, which is to show you sort of how we do basic animations of time series. So in this, I just duplicated the step. And on this first step, what we're going to do is add a filter to look just at the first day, basically. And so if I create a filter and I look at the day, and I think it's the 10th, if I recall correctly. Yeah, so it's the 10th. You'll notice that I put in 10 and, oh, sorry, greater, it's less than 10. Less than 11. Less than 11. So here is the 10th basically showing. And the reason it's taking up the whole screen here is because of this little checkbox here, collapse axes when filtered. So as I'm filtering, it's still maintaining its width. So you're seeing how it updates that way. So you can control that by basically unchecking it. And that way it will maintain the domain that you've originally set, and then you can see things fill in. So 2 other things to quickly note here. If I click next, watch how this animation occurs. And let me just slow this down just a hair, like going in here and going into advanced and adding just a little bit more time between steps. Great. So if I click next here, you'll notice how this populates. You see the connection lines leave. Now you're seeing this animate to the right, basically removing that filter on the time domain until this comes in and then the connections pop in. Now, if on connections, I select this animate perspective change, what that means is that the connection line is going to stay visible and try to animate with the line itself. So now this animation or this view will look different. It's going to look like this. Here, I'll show you. So the connection lines are going to stay there, and you're going to sort of see them come in a little bit more dynamic of way, and they're coming in from the center 0, 0, 0. So you can position that appropriately. So these are sort of minor nuances that you probably would miss otherwise, but I think are important in terms of understanding some of the capabilities of sort of animating between steps.
Can you repeat that, what you just said, how to do that?
Sure, absolutely. So this first step, what we've done is added a filter, and that filter is basically filtering the day, this date time field by just looking at days less than 12. So it starts on the 10th and goes through the 15th, or sorry, goes through the 20th. And so as we update the day, we'll see this animate through. Now, the second position has no filters. So that's why you're seeing this animation from step 1 to step 2. The detail that I was just covering is this little button called Animate Perspective Change that you'll want to turn on for connections if you want the connections to maintain visibility as you're animating between steps. If you uncheck it, then you will basically see connections disappear and then reappear after the scene has stopped. So it's something kind of minor here, but hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Any questions there? Did that make sense?
I'll just mention why. You know, in this example, it seems kind of obvious that you'd want to animate the perspective change. But if you're going from maybe a random view and you just have, you know, thousands of lines being drawn in a random way around the screen as they animate into the new step, then that's pretty ugly. So basically just know that you can decide whether you want your connections to be animating from step to step or disappearing and not animating step to step. And that's what that checkbox does. And you just try it until you decide which one of those two you think looks best.
Great. So I'm going to go ahead and delete my first step with the filter just so we can stay all on the same page, and looks like that actually deleted it. Okay, so let me go ahead and remove my filter here. Okay, so let's add just one other thing, which is some interaction where we can highlight the actual fuel type, which is this depth axis, as a reminder of what that is. You know, we could, just as an example, say, look at the date time, so that now when I select, it's actually going to select all of those date times. So, you know, different options, right, based on what we're trying to go after here. But I think it makes the most sense not to do that, but instead to show the fuel type so that as I select a dot, it will show that row more clearly. And I think that's what I'd like. So, and I think the other thing we did was actually add a mist so everything turns dark as well. So I'll just do that for consistency's sake. And this is going to be another detail that is another sort of minor detail, but I think is impactful. So what we're going to do is duplicate this swarm, and what we're going to try to do here is, if you can recall, there's a bar that goes on top to say this is 100% capacity, so you can more easily see those drops. And so to do that, we're going to duplicate the swarm, which duplicates all the perspectives that have been made and maintains everything the same. And then we're going to change the height axis, I believe it's to capacity. So it's just one number for capacity. And so that's the 100% capacity. Now, the other thing you'll notice here is that the axes, we now have two swarms that are exactly in the same position. And so we actually have two axes labels going on. And so this is what I mean, where things start to get a little more complicated when you add more swarms together and things like that. But if we go into axis options, the easiest thing to do is we can just turn off these axes so that those are not visible since we don't need them. Now, the one thing to note is that if you're doing this, be mindful of the ranges that you have. If you're going to basically assume that this chart is still accurate for the other graph. So that's something to keep in mind. And we don't need to have any interactions on this. So I'm actually going to turn off the ability to highlight this. I don't want that for that. So now we've essentially set up the supply story. And how I'd like to tell that story is first by showing the overall capacity, then showing the percentage breakdown, and then showing it over time. So that's 4 different steps. So let's start with that first step where we're going to add in a filter to look just at the column total. And this is something we're changing here, but in the meantime, you switch it to contains first, basically meaning I'm going to look for a string of characters, and then I'm going to select the fuel type, and I'm going to look at just total. And by doing that, and I realize I'm actually in swarm 2 here, so it did update correctly, but I actually want to look at swarm 1 in particular. So let me go back to swarm 1, and on this, add the filter for contains, then select fuel type, and then type in total. So we should see just the total come in. Now I do want to add an additional filter to look at just the first day. So I'm going to add an and statement as opposed to or, and I'm going to look at basically days less than 11. So I'm going to look at the day less than 11. So now we have the first day total capacity, and we can actually see that decrease. So I think when I actually showed it, I started just at the first hour, but that's just a small detail here. So now we have the first step. Let's go ahead and duplicate that step. And now we're going to remove the filter for total so that we can see all of the different contributors. And we probably want to add some on select details so that people can see like the percentage of capacity that's currently there. There's more we could add. Obviously, I'm just trying to move a little quicker here so that we can keep going through. And so now we see the component parts. I'm going to set that camera for that. And then I'm going to add another step. And on this last step, let's go ahead and have this animate out through everything. I realize here on step 2, I should actually remove the filter on the second swarm so that we can see all of the lines on top. There we go. So now we have all the lines on top. So if we go back to step 3, now on this step, we are basically just going to remove the day filter. And with that, we should now have our story. And it looks like this one didn't create another perspective after adding that change in filter. So something to note, we'll have to look into. But anyways, so we see the first, and then we can see the component parts of that whole, and we can see it animate over time. Now it looks like might be something going on with perspectives here that I might have missed. But yeah. But yeah, that's basically a quick story of building this supply graph. There's just one thing here. I don't know why the filter didn't stick here. This should be the filter to look at the days less than 11. Okay, so I'm just going to click the home button so this saves, and we can come back into it just in case there was something going on there.